Hello and welcome to Alumni Reunion and the stress-free degree program. So Stobo says he's pro-stress. So either way, stress or stress-free. This session features authors Douglas Sanderson and Andrew Stobo Sniderman discussing their award-winning book. Can't see it, and then it looks backwards. Valley of the Birdtail. My name is Judith Rae, and I'm a partner at Olthius Clear Townshend, which is a law firm. I'm a graduate of both the Faculty of Law and Faculty of Social Work at U of T. In my work, I work as a lawyer for First Nation and Inuit governments and organizations. I work especially in areas related to governance, services, social issues such as education, which is part of today's subject, and other areas. I'm very much looking forward to moderating today's discussion. We encourage anyone out there to ask questions in the Q&A, which is located at the bottom of your screen, and I will see the questions. Before we dig in, I wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For many, many, many generations, it has been the traditional land of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca. And today, Toronto is home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island and beyond. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to live and work here, personally. I'll introduce our authors and speakers. Professor Douglas Sanderson, Amo Binashii, is Beaver Clan from the Opaskwayak Cree Nation. He's a professor at the Faculty of Law and holds the Pritchard Wilson Chair in Law and Public Policy. He was previously a senior advisor to the Ontario Minister responsible for Aboriginal Affairs and the Attorney General. His scholarship focuses on Indigenous institutions, post-colonial reconciliation, and rebuilding community. And he was a wonderful professor to me while I was at law school, as well as to Stobo when he was there. Yeah. Andrew Stobo Sniderman is a Rhodes Scholar, writer, and lawyer. He's argued before the Supreme Court of Canada, served as the Human Rights Policy Advisor to the Canadian Minister of Foreign Affairs, and as a law clerk of South Africa's Constitutional Court. And not to be missed, articled at my firm, OKT, which was wonderful. There. So just briefly getting into it, introducing the book, Valley of the Birdtail is an awesome book. I was thrilled to read it myself. And you guys maybe have an elevator clip for it, so I'm going to turn it over to you. But, it deals with education. That's one of the reasons I'm very passionate about it. But it's also really human. It's about people and their stories, and it's about two communities side by side, a First Nations reserve and mainstream community. And it deals with really our whole history as a country, all wrapped within that. So maybe with that, I'll turn to you, Professor Sanderson, to just tell us a little bit more, to introduce the book. What is it about?
Yeah. Thanks so much, Judith. Thanks for having us here for Alumni Day. And let me say what a privilege and a pleasure it is to be on the virtual stage with two former students. Yay! This is university. It's working. Yay! So Valley of the Birdtail is, as you say, really, it's, in many ways, it's a history of Canada. And a story like that, you can tell a lot of different ways. And the way we tell our version of the story is to try and tell an intimate story of Canada. And the way we do that is by following the lives of two families, more or less since Confederation, 150 so years ago. One family is Ukrainian immigrants who settle in a little town called Rossburn, and right next door, right across the river, is the Wayway-Sikapo Indian Reserve. And the reserve and the town are formed more or less at the same time. And so these two communities develop and grow side by side for a century and a half. And in some ways, what you get there is a little version of something that happens all over Canada. There's a reserve, there's a town right across the river or right next door. This is a motif all across the country. And what we do in following these two families, living in these two communities, is we get a chance to see the results of a really sort of terrible social experiment. And that's, what happens if you take two identically situated communities founded at the same time, and one of them you support economically, you provide decent schools for their children, you give them access to credit and cheap land, you encourage and promote their culture and language. It turns out you get this really thriving, successful community of Ukrainian Canadians who are part of the backbone of the Canadian culture. And what happens if right across the river, you do exactly the opposite, and you take a community, you steal their children, you deny them access to credit, access to markets. And it turns out, so over generations in Valley of the Birdtail, as we tell the story, we see the effects of these policies on actual families. And the result is an explanation, I think, for how it is we ended up in the situation of disparity and inequality that we see all around us. None of us needs to walk very far from where we live to see that tremendous disparity of wealth. And Valley of the Birdtail explains how it is we got into this situation, and then tries to offer some solutions for how it is we might change things if we wanted to live in a different Canada.
Thank you so much. It is such a great book. I know, and people may say that in all kinds of things they moderate about books, but I really cannot recommend it highly enough to anyone out there. I honestly have never read a more readable, accessible, really compelling read that provides such a rich education for me as a reader, right? For readers out there about us as a country and exactly how we have been so different and how that interacts. And it's done so personally, following those two families in such a way that is so engaging. So I just want to thank you both.
Thanks for that, Judith.
I want to thank you both for the book. Okay, so I think what I'd like to ask next to kind of dig in is what kind of personally brought each of you to the book. You have different life experiences yourself. So I'd like to maybe start with Stobo and go back to Professor Sanderson. What brought you personally, yourself, to do the book?
Yeah, thanks for that. And I want to say thank you, Judith, for moderating, and thanks to the whole U of T team for putting this all together. I want to say I really wish we were here together, in part because we were going to give a bunch of free books to people, and then I could just give high fives to Douglas and Judith. But the one upside to doing it on Zoom is that we get to see Douglas's cat on camera. Pretty cool. So
he loves the Zoom call.
He loves Zoom calls. So what brought me to this book? I think in part I want to credit the two people on this call with me. One of them is Douglas, who was my teacher. As you were saying, Judith, he was also your teacher. And I remember during my first year of law school, learning, I think maybe from a conversation with you, Judith, or by reading the news, that Canada for my entire lifetime, I'm 40 years old, for my entire lifetime had been providing much worse basic services for people living on reserve. So we're talking about 500,000 people, more or less, or 400,000 people getting worse schools, child welfare services, healthcare services, lack of access to water. And this fact just kind of started eating at me. I couldn't figure out how that could be. And I remember going into Douglas's office at some point and saying, Professor Sanderson, how could it be that Indigenous people are getting so much less? And he kind of looked at me and he's like, man, you have a lot to learn, my friend. And obviously I was naive enough to ask that question. And that was 12 years ago, I think, that we had that conversation. And that was the germ for this story. And I kind of set out to look for a story to tell that problem. And I like the way you put it, Judith, where, it's almost like we've embedded these big problems in an accessible story, which is the goal. And then maybe the second thing I'll mention is that I went to go work with Judith's firm. And if there's lawyers on the call, certainly there's not everyone here is a lawyer, but you'll know that justice is possible in our courts, but it is often very slow and sometimes tedious and often fruitless. And I think I had this feeling that maybe my contribution was not to be someone fighting like hell in courts, although we need that, and kind of this sickening feeling that the courts and the judges are not going to save us. I don't think anyone really thinks that, but knowing that we've got to do work with Canadians, and maybe, again, naively, maybe there's a theme developing. I thought, if I could just help explain this problem, it would make it a little bit less likely to happen. And Douglas and I have poured ourselves into this book for years and years and years before it came out. I think with the hope that people would pick it up and change their minds, and all the bad stuff that happened would be a little bit less likely to happen. And some of the exciting stuff and the hopeful stuff that we get into at the end of the book kind of motivates them to be a little bit more engaged with these questions. So I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Stobo. And I want to turn to you on the same question, Professor Sanderson.
So thank you. Stobo actually began work on this project more than 10 years ago while he was still a student at the U of T. And, he was writing as a journalist for Acclaimed magazine and looking for a way of talking about this inequality. And that one thing led to another, and that led to years of Stobo's intensive research and interview work to develop the background materials for the manuscript, and came to me about 5 years ago ish to say, here's what I've got, but I think that the reality is that I can't actually do this alone. Like I, as a as a non-Indigenous person, not sure that I can capture everything. And so I thought, well, I don't know about that, but it turns out he was right. There were occasions when it was really very helpful to have a multitude of perspectives. And for me, I was really, really interested in finally being able to tell a whole story of Canada. I just think that the history piece is so important. And I think that, most of us walk around with this idea in our heads that we somehow know or understand Canadian history, even though really we probably took it in grade 9 high school and learned about pioneers and haven't gone on to do serious study or complete a graduate degree or, really, really seek out, knowledge about history. We just think we understand it. So being able to tell this story in an approachable way really explains and develops the history. And that's so important, I think, because the solutions that we seek to the problems all around us, when it comes to this troubled relationship, those solutions don't make any sense unless you sort of can understand the whole arc of the problem, the whole totality of the relationship. And once that snaps more clearly into focus, then the kinds of solutions that we want to talk about become more self-evident.
Thanks so much.
Oh, nope. Saved.
Okay. I just want to mention that U of T has let me know that even though we are not in person, alumni relations can raffle off books. And there will be some information to share following this online event that will include some information on how to get the book. And I really encourage you to get the book, read the book, give it as a gift. Give it to your mom, give it to your dad, give it to your teens, give it around. It's a great book. No one will regret reading this book. I really feel that. I want to kind of ask a little bit, this is probably a little more to you, Stobo, around, the personal stories in the book really is what brings it to life. I think it's what makes the book so engaging and different than other books that deal with the history of, Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations in Canada and Indigenous experiences. Like, well, there's not the only one to deal with the personal history, but I think, in terms of the breadth of the book historically is large. It's not just a personal story and it tracks these different generations, but it's that personal touch that makes it so compelling. And I just wanted to kind of ask you about that. Like, how did you go about that? How did you find the people the book is about, and how did you get to know them? What was that like? What was that process like of developing the book?
Thanks for that, Judith. Yeah, I mean, as people will see if they pick up the book, there's this kind of list of characters at the beginning of the book. There's 9 people that we try to tell the whole story of Canada, as Douglas put it, through their lives. Half of them are dead, and so there's about 5 people who we try to really get in their shoes, and they're about half Indigenous and half not Indigenous. And I think there's no, the best way to answer that question is just to say, I hung out with these people for years, and it really started as this hunch from Toronto that there was some much deeper story happening in these communities in Manitoba. It was no more than a hunch. And getting fired from my job in Ottawa because my minister got shuffled, and kind of having a sad couple weeks on my couch thinking, what do I do with my life? And the answer to that was follow this hunch, book a one-way ticket with the support of my then girlfriend, now wife, to Winnipeg, drive out to this place and hang out with people and sleep in my car, rented car. And that's really what it was. And with the invitation, I should say, of the Indigenous community, Waywacy Capo, I got permission to come and talk to people. And what you don't see in the book is all the conversations that I had that, didn't lead to a character in the book, but are of course valuable. So it's just going from friend to family member and having tea with them and eating meals with them, and slowly earning people's trust and explaining to them all the while, what are we trying to do with this book? And it turns out that actually ask and obviously want to learn, that most people are willing to share a lot with you. And certainly that's what I found. And as Douglas was saying, there are limits to what I can do, I think, as a non-Indigenous person, but you can go a long way. I think one of the great lessons for me is that it is possible to reach out to total strangers who in many ways are totally different from you and make a meaningful connection to them. And I think this story shows that it's possible to build that kind of relationship. And I'll skip to the end, where years later, after I've spent all this time with people, thankfully pre-COVID, almost all of it, the rest, there were a couple conversations after COVID started. Douglas and I have this very scary, well, in the eyes of the publisher, it's scary, where we print out the pages that involve a given person and we mail it to them with the question, what do you think? Is this true? Is it fair? Are you comfortable with this? And had anyone said no, then the whole book collapses. And that would have been bad. But thankfully, everyone to a person said, you can keep everything. Here's a few things that you should fix. And here's more stuff to make it better. And moreover, you can use our real names. No one's using a pseudonym. Everyone had the option to use a pseudonym, which I think is the ultimate testament to the fact that people trusted us. And then I think that we earned that trust. And no one, I should say, comes off looking like an angel, I don't think. And at the end of the book also is written by one of the characters, Maureen Two Voice. And in some ways, I think it's the best part of the book. And so this Maureen, I think she gave an interview and she said, this book didn't feel like something that was written about us. It felt like a book that was written with us. And I think that's the best kind of compliment you can give to this book. And I think it's what gives the book its power. We try to get in the shoes, in the lives of neighbors looking at each other across this river, starting knowing nothing about each other and slowly learning about each other, which is, of course, what we all are able and have to do.
It does give the book its power. And, maybe this is a good time. Like, I just want to thank I want to thank those people, who contributed to the book in this way. Maureen, Linda, Troy, and the others, it's incredible. Their contributions to this book are enormous. And it really does. That is what gives the book its power. I just really want to support that and thank the people who contributed to the book and worked with you in that way.
Yeah, thanks, Judith. And I should say that I sometimes joke with Maureen. I say, "Hey, Maureen, when I first walked into your office in the school and asked if I could chat with you, did you know you're going to be hanging out with me for like 5 years?"
Probably not.
The answer was no, but it worked out okay. Yeah. But they gave a lot.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I have a question I want to ask both of you. Kind of focusing in on the education piece, but more broadly, you were talking a bit about this earlier, Stobo, the, services in general and the stark and obvious, as a quote in the book is of a deputy minister, are the stark and obvious inequality, the underfunding in services. One of the things, I think the book is a fantastic resource about Canadian history going, as you say, back that 150 years to the founding of the two communities, in the, 19th century, and it talks about residential schools, and it's a great learning tool, about residential schools in general and the, intergenerational trauma they face. But I think the other piece that I'm really, glad I got into, and so when you talked about this being really what compelled you to write the book, is, about the underfunding of First Nation services and, including schools in the very, very modern era, you know what I mean? Through the last 50 years, right? Through the last 50 years. And I think that's something we don't have quite as many resources on, as a nation, at least not that many good resources. Mm-hmm. We sometimes have resources that just describe it or a little bit of the impression of what something looks like on the ground, the schools, the water or something, but why, right? And is that real? And what are we really seeing? And what's behind that and why? I just want to say I love, maybe it's just me, I love the part of the book where the school finance director, Jackie, is walking Troy, who's from the white Ukrainian side of town, and he's become a gym teacher at the First Nation school, and then he's become the principal, and he's the new principal. She's like, well, let me show you the budget. Let me walk you through it. And he does the math on a calculator, and he's like, I just cannot understand. I just don't understand why literally just dollar per dollar they're getting, the provincial school is getting 40% more than they're getting dollar per student, or, 60% more once they've paid the provincial school to take their high school students.
It's crazy.
And, this was something I learned a lot about in my adulthood, and was very, like you, curious to know more. I wanted to, I need to get to the bottom of this. I need to really understand this. But I like, in the book, Troy says to himself, if I tell people in town, no one will believe me. And I think that goes to the heart of something. I want to ask both of you about it. I'll start with you, Douglas. Stobo talked about coming into your office and asking that question and you being like, where do I begin? What is that like? What do we do with this? What do we do with this issue? It's a core issue, I think, in our nation, right?
Well, so thanks for that incredibly difficult question.
That's a big question. Okay.
It's a big question. So I think one of the weirdest things that's happened over the course of the past few years has been my thinking about ideas around truth. And like, it seems like we're all driven, like even the media. And I did do some journalism school when I was much younger. Like this idea that if you see something sourced 3 different places, then it's true, and you don't need to footnote it. I've kind of actually locked us into this really just incredibly simple and untrue version of our history. And so, so being able to talk, being able to show how those systems that we've been developing and how they've all worked together over time, I think explaining that historically makes the thinking about future stuff make more sense. And Stobo, maybe you want to pick it up there.
Yeah. And I think I want to get back to the outrage in the question, because I think in a way at the beginning of this talk, I dodged on a personal level what got me involved. And I think to get back to that, it was like probably most of the people probably listening to this chat, I didn't know anything about any of these issues, frankly, until I started hearing about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It started talking about residential schools, and it was an awful beginning of an education I started to get. But the thing that hooked itself into my soul, if I may put it in a dramatic way, was learning that today, as Judith, you were just saying, in the last 50 years, our entire lifetimes, we were doing a version of the same thing, which was giving all these Indigenous children such worse schools and services writ large. And the why question was driving me mad. And I think that's the question that's in part at the heart of this book, and trying to understand why. How could you do this? And the method for answering that here is, you've got 2 schools. One of them's on a reserve. One of them's on this town. They're divided by this valley and this river. What does that look like from the town? Like, do people notice? Do they care? It's like they're right there, which is, of course, a metaphor for everything that's happening in our country. Like the inequality, it's right there in our face. And so I want to try to explain that to myself, at least, and hopefully in the book. And to get into the substance for a moment, I think part of it is that physically reserves are divided. I think most of people in Canada have never set foot in a reserve. So it's really easy to ignore something if you don't have to see it. Part of it, without getting into too much jurisdictional con law stuff, is that there's different governments ultimately responsible for the services. So if you're on a reserve, the federal government is technically responsible for funding these services. And if you're in a normal public school, it's the province. But in a very real way, the reason that matters is because if you're in a public school and there's a cut to your service, it affects 90% of parents and their kids and their families. And so everyone has an interest in working on that. But if you're on a reserve and you're falling behind, you're a tiny number of people, and most people just kind of go on with their business. And then the third bucket of the answer, which is the really complicated one, which I think we are trying to get at in the book, is how do we normalize the inequality? There is this inequality. Why don't we see it? And I think you're right that the heart of the issue is that Troy, who's a guy who sees it for the first time, and he says to himself, this is so wrong, but if I told it to my friends, they wouldn't believe me. And we try to explain this at length, but to me, the big insight is that a lot of people look at Indigenous people and they think to themselves, they're being treated better. And often that's just based on a series of falsehoods. And non-Indigenous people have this idea of equality where they think, if we could just all be treated the exact same, then things would work out. And in their own minds, that's not happening. And actually, Indigenous people are being treated better. And so it kind of makes it okay to not pay attention. And we try to empathize with that person, that non-Indigenous person, as difficult as it is, who's looking at the reserve thinking, man, they've got such a good deal. We're trying to get inside their heads to A, understand where that's coming from, and B, try to figure out how to persuade that person to change their mind, because they've got to change their mind, because that's standing in the way of more of us saying, this is wrong. We need to do more about this.
Yeah, I think the thing that we really sort of came to understand and about how people are able to live in this world where they can sort of see this inequality and not and it has to do, we think, with in particular this Ukrainian community that was brought from poverty in Europe to Canada, and who struggled so hard. Like, this was not an easy transition, and it took generations, and it was incredibly hard work, and they faced incredible racism, and they persevered, and then become these sort of model citizens. When they tell their story, of course, they're like folk heroes in their own minds. And of course they are, because they struggled and succeeded against great odds. In telling that story, it's really, what we discovered was that it becomes really easy to look across the river and say, like, we faced all this adversity, and now look at us, right? What's wrong with you? Mm-hmm. And they just didn't see the underpinning structural reasons why this inequality exists and why it continues. So telling this story about how we got here and how it in fact is actually taking on many of those racist tropes, and just like, one of the things we said when we were writing was like we want to be fair to racists, right? Like, let's hear them out. Let's write down what they have to say. Let's address those very, very issues. And so I hope in doing that, we're able to provide the kind of information. I mean, that's what's, that's why people, that's why these one community, it's because they don't know about the other community, even though they live next door. They just have all these preconceived notions. So hopefully we're, hopefully the book puts people into a place where, with that full information, they're able to think and understand more clearly why that inequality exists. And in doing so, we hope generates some will to change things.
That is a great jumping off point for a question from the audience. There is an audience, and they have questions.
Woohoo!
And one of them is about do you know anything about how the people of Rossburn have responded to the book? Which I think is an interesting question. As you mentioned earlier, like, it's not just about Rossburn, right? It's not like it's about a town, it's about a reserve. They're kind of stand-ins for all the rest of us. It's not really just about them, but it kind of is about them. It's they're profiled in the book. How have they responded?
I should first joke that I think no community in Canada has more per capita books of this copies of this book than Rossburn. It's kind of cool. I think everyone and their uncle
good for them.
And everyone and their racist uncle has a book, which is a bad joke, but it's amazing, and it's created all these conversations there. So I think, to my great relief, it's been received well, and there is a book who is very conservative and is kind of the mouthpiece for articulating, who is the former mayor of this town, who's articulating a lot of the very conservative, some might say very wrong-headed views about their Indigenous neighbors. He's saying all these things, and Douglas and I are responding to them. And when there was a book launch for the book, I was kind of worried to see how he would react and whether there would be some kind of scene or great argument, which would be fine. And he ended up having COVID that day, sadly, but his wife came and stood in the line to get a signature for her husband on the book. And I think that was a sign to me that, though he totally disagreed with where we ended up, which I know because I spoke to him, he still felt respected as someone whose voice was articulated in the book. And the mayor of the town, along with the chief of Wewesi Kappa, was interviewed by a reporter like 6 months after the book came out. And the reporter said, "Hey, what do you think of this book?" And they were both prickly characters. They both said, "It's really a great book, and we encourage people to read it. And it's creating a conversation between our communities, the likes of which has never really happened." So I can't sit here and say that everyone in Rossburn has read and loves the book, but all I've heard is of people reading it with it and engaging with it. And Douglas and I called into the grade 11 English class in the town high school, which of course has some students from the reserve and some students from the town. And they read it for high school, which is amazing. And at the end of the conversation, Douglas or I asked, did you change your mind about stuff? And if I'm remembering correctly, everyone but one person put up their hand and said, "Yeah, I changed my mind." And it was the chapter about misconceptions and us responding to them that said, yeah, I thought all that stuff and I've changed my mind. And I gave the book to my dad or my grandfather. And so I think it's gone really, really well. And Troy and Nelson, who are the characters in this town, are getting nothing but love and plaudits for, the years of hanging out with me.
Great.
And I got to say also that like, it's our favorite thing to hear, like people giving the book to their children, that's awesome. But our favorite thing is when they pass it a generation up, when they're like, "Grandma was pretty racist, but maybe with the right information." And it turns out Grandma comes around. So yay.
Yeah. It's been, I think it is such a great teaching tool. I really do encourage everyone to get the book, read the book, give the book away. And it's, no one is vilified in this book. You know what I mean? Like everyone is a human. Maybe some historical characters. Okay, maybe it's like
there's one really
there's
bad
literally a guy named Hader Reed.
Okay, maybe that's what's it. Maybe I'm wrong, but the living humans are. I agree. All treated with respect. Yeah. I really think that humanity makes a difference.
Like even Hader Reed, who it turns out was a really, really terrible bad man, who and actually served as like the Indian agent for the region that we write about. Like he was hard to write about because he was such an awful person on the surface. Like he's the guy who writes in his journal that like, "Oh, when it comes to Indians, like a little starvation will do them good." And yet in his, what we have to work with is like his journal stuff. And like, he's like got this really tremendous view of himself as this really beneficent, very learned person. And he was certainly not a dumb person, but that's a really hard character to write when, there's this romantic version of Canada that he exemplifies, I'm the lone guy on the prairies and my dog team, and that's and he sees that in himself, and so we want to we sort of want to reflect kind of the reality of that situationality, but at the same time, like he's doing really terrible bad things and writing about them in his journal so proudly. It's hard to not have him seem a little hollow, even though we really did our best to try and make him a full person. Stobo. Go ahead. Yeah.
No, sorry, Douglas.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. And I just wanted to kind of get back. I kind of made a glib remark about your racist uncle, which I don't love about myself, because I think one of the work that I and maybe we were trying to do in this book is to not take the easy way out, which is to say, why are there so many unequal services in Canada? Oh, it's because we're racist. I think that is a perfectly legitimate answer, but it's not. We can go so much beyond that, and we need to scratch beyond the surface and understand what that means. And so, as I think Judith, you were just getting at, we're not vilifying anyone in the sense that we're really trying to go out of our way to hear people out. And I think it is so easy perhaps especially from a fancy place like U of T in downtown Toronto, to think, there's this backwater rural town and they must be a bunch of stupid racist farmers. And it's absolutely not the case, obviously. And when you spend time with people, or when I spend time with people, the overwhelming feeling is, I like these people. I really like these people. And their worldview is one I need to take the time to understand with care and respect. And as Douglas was getting at earlier, there is this amazing story that Ukrainian Canadians have. And it's not just them, it's every immigrant community in this country, which is, we came with not that much and we worked our asses off and we've done better. And I think that's a very potent armament that they have to kind of push forward, and they facing real adversity. And it's also, it turns out, often a blinder that makes it hard for people to see this other story happening in the country about all the policies and the barriers that Indigenous people face that make it almost impossible for them to succeed. And so we're really going out of our way to say, okay, I'm not going to just throw a racist label at you. Let's hear you out, in part because we may have it wrong and we're missing a key part of the picture, which I think is true. And B, because I actually want to persuade you to become my partner and my friend to work on addressing these problems, which ultimately I think is what it's going to take to solve the kinds of issues that Judith works on every day at her law firm, which is more and more Canadians who are not already involved in these issues, not just reading our book, although that's a tiny little part of this, but learning a bit more and being engaged with this stuff so that we can be on guard to stop some of the most awful abuses and hopefully respond to the positive stuff that's going on and to support that comes up in our politics.
100%. Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm going to take a question here from the audience that is very similar to the next question I had planned, which is, or it links with it anyway. The question is the federal government increasing spending at schools across Canada on reserves or just a few? And let's talk about that. Let's talk about that. Because, where the book ends, right, is in this time of hopeful change for the reserve. And, they've made a certain deal and they've increased their funding to equal the provincial funding, and they're seeing good results from that. And, it's a hopeful time. And I support that 100%. I'll just add a little bit. I'm going to answer the question a little bit myself. That's probably not allowed as a moderator, but it comes from my experience and my work. And then I'm going to turn it to you guys. Don't worry. But just to say, what we saw next is that in around 2017, the federal government did update its policies nationally, such that its new policy was that all the reserve schools should be able to, should be receiving funding at the same amount as provincial schools. And the point I want to make, though, is that, so in that way, there was an increase to all the schools that then followed. However, I want to make the point that from my perspective, and I suspect from yours, Stobo and Douglas, is that no, we have not reached equality. We have not reached, legal equality in the funding of schools and a number of other services on reserves. And that's for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is because you can have all kinds of fight about the math, about how you make math equal to provincial funding. Trust me, I have seen, just to give one example, I have a client that literally hired the provincial finance director to say, here is how you would calculate provincial funding for our schools. And the federal government would not fund that. They had their own way of doing the math, and it was magically quite a lot less. And
let's write a story about that guy, Judith.
Oh yeah, we'll do.
Yeah.
But the other piece, right, and you guys know this, and any law students out there will know this, or lawyers, but not everyone out there needs to be a law student or lawyer. But that is also not how we define equality in Canada, is to say we all get the same dollars per person, because we recognize that there are different needs fundamentally that mean that the same amount of money is not going to be equal, fair in that sense. In the sense that there's a fairness aspect to equality that we go beyond. Just to give a little legal lesson, Canadian law goes beyond what's called formal equality, which is where the federal government's current policy would be at, and creates a standard that's called substantive equality. So anyway, that's my little lawyer's lesson for the crowd. But I do want to turn that question over to you. Professor Sanderson probably would be good to go to next. And, where are we now? Would you like to comment on that?
Well, so I'm so glad that you actually took the time to do a teaching here, Judith, because I actually have not really been following up on the numbers. As I understand it, yes, there's this commitment to equality, but one of the things that we have to do in the book is we talk a little bit about what does that even really mean? What are we shooting for when we think about equality? And what we think probably the goal that makes sense is an equality of outcomes, right? And that just sort of just costs what it costs, unfortunately. And the more remote communities you are, because the more expensive everything is, including education services. And also, we've got 80, 100 years of catch up to do as well. And so, all of that said, what we know is that increased funding really does help pretty quickly improve things like reading scores. That's for sure. But we also think that that sort of this spending levels is, while crucial in the immediate and near term, it's not ultimately going to be the answer, right? Because we realize that governments can cut funding whenever, right? Or you don't even have to. You can just keep funding the same and let inflation do the work for you, right? And so in the end, this premise of equality can only really be realized, we think, in a situation where Indigenous communities have much greater access to capacities like taxation, so that they could raise money. Right now, all Indigenous communities basically live in a kind of feudal subsistence, right? They can't raise any money on their own, or very little, or it's very difficult to do. And so it's all federal transfer money, and that literally pays for everything, right? And so that's why, why is it so hard to get fresh water in reserve? And it's because, the water treatment plant's broken, and the federal government doesn't want to give us money to fix it. So there you go. So as long as that is sort of the nature of the relationship structurally, funding is going to be part of that question, but it's not, we think, ultimately the answer. Stobo, what do you want to?
Yeah, I think, the book is structured as a story. It's 95% story. And then the last 5% is okay, here's what we think it's going to take to actually have a durable long-term solution, and that's the direction we head in. It's a governance change, and I think to persuade you to accept that, you've got to hear the story. And I just want to get back to Judith's point, just on the funding, to remind people that with public schools in Ontario, it's not like every kid gets the same amount of money. This more sophisticated view of equality, it's already baked into the way that our public schools work. If you are more remote in a rural place, you're going to get more funding because, surprise, surprise, it costs more to deliver services there. There's less economies of scale. If you have a higher concentration of poverty, there's more funding. The province accounts for that. If there's a lot of second language learners, the province accounts for that. And yet, as you were getting at, Judith, I want to give the federal government some credit for saying openly, hey, this is wrong, that kids on reserves are getting less by an average. So I'm glad that they said that and they won that argument and they gave more funding. But there's so much further to go, because none of the models that I've seen, and better than us, account for all those same factors: remoteness, second language learners. There's many of those in many Indigenous communities, and concentration of poverty, it would mean giving a lot more. And dude, we've been underfunding these places for 40 years. Can we also account for that? Like, just getting up to the bare minimum today is obviously not going to make up for all of that. And it makes no sense for us to be having all these underprepared students who usually end up in public high schools anyway. It's just bad public policy. It's immoral, and we're still doing it. And so there's a lot of work to do.
There is. There is a lot of work to do. There's a lot of great questions coming in from the audience, but I think we are in our last few minutes. And what I want to turn to each of you on is just big picture. You know, if there's one thing you'd like people to take away from the book, what would that be?
So, you know, the history piece is really important, and most of the book is the history piece. Like Stobo says, it's sort of a setup for the argument at the end. And I think the thing that I would want people to take away more than anything else is a sense that change is possible, and that the nature of the political situation is that Indigenous peoples are a tiny percentage of the population, that these kinds of changes that are required are not really legal problems, they're political problems. They require political solutions. So that means a plurality of Canadians rowing in the same direction on this question. And I would hope that, you know, people don't get discouraged, because change, you know, is slow. And things build over time. And I recently came to an analogy about thinking, you know, how to think about this in the present day, and that's to like imagine that you could go back into the past, and you know, like we all know, like the problem is like you never know what you do, right? It could have enormous consequences, change everything forever. Maybe you don't exist, and yet in the present day, we're like, oh no, I don't know if what I'm doing is making any difference. It makes a difference. Like, so believe in yourselves and believe in our ability and capacity to change and to make things better.
You stole my point, man.
Sorry, dude.
No, I think I want to double down on that point, which is to say that this is a hopeful book, and I don't think it's a false hope. I think it's very easy, and Douglas and Judith, who've, you know, worked your entire professional lives in this area, you can maybe agree with this. It's very easy to get mired in anger and despair and hopelessness, frankly, when you work on some of these issues, because there's a lot of hurt and despair out there. But this is not a book that wanted to bring the reader into that and roll you around in that and leave you in that. It's also a book about hope and mutual understanding and empathy. And I find that really exciting. I think that what I want people to leave this with is a feeling that it doesn't have to be such a drag to learn about this stuff. And maybe I'll just leave you with, I think, the hopeful story of Troy's father, Nelson Lahoe, who you meet in this story more or less when he's 75 years old. He's a grown-ass man. He spent his whole life teaching in public school, living in this town across the river from this reserve. And he's never had an actual conversation with an Indigenous person. They are his neighbors. He knows nothing about them. Of course, that's most of us in Canada. We don't have any meaningful contact with Indigenous people. He retires, and he gets a call from the, you know, continuing education program on the reserve saying, hey, Nelson, do you think you might pitch in a little bit on the reserve? And he thinks to himself, oh, if this is going to affect my pension, I'm not going to do that. But it doesn't. And he's kind of bored because his wife is still working. And so he says, all right, I'll give it a shot. And he ends up going to the reserve for the first time in his life. He's terrified because there's actual three-dimensional, non-stereotypical Indigenous people all around him. And what does he discover? It's people he can relate to. Most of what he thought was true is not. And slowly, this story he's built in his mind kind of unravels. And Nelson, over time, like I think he's taught a huge, I forget the exact number, but like 900 students over the last 20 years in the continuing ed program, which is a big percent of the population on the reserve. And a guy who used to, if not laugh at, sit through his friends laughing at racist jokes over lunch every day at the bar, is now someone who, if you go to the reserve and go to a hockey game at their beautiful hockey arena, people will pull out a chair for him so that he can sit down. He had polio as a child, so he goes around on walkers, and he's earned people's respect. And I'll leave you with something that he says at the end of the book, which is, I think, a brave thing to say. And he says, "I was a racist," which I think very few of us are willing to say, even though it's true of a lot of us. And then he says, "And I likely still am." And I think that is a truly brave thing to say, which is to say, I'm still learning. I'm still learning how to change, and I'm up for that. And we all need to be up for that. And I find him an unbelievably hopeful person because he shows us that it's possible for us to change and to learn, and we can't just sign off on these issues thinking it's kind of a drag and it's the way it is. I think we're all a part of this, whether we like it or not, and we're able to learn and change. And that's amazing. And I hope the reader leaves with that feeling that it's amazing and hopeful.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nelson.
Nelson.
Thank you, Troy, Linda, Maureen, and the others in the book. Thank you, Stobo. Thank you, Professor Sanderson. And thank you, audience. I'm so glad there was an audience. I really didn't know what to expect in the online format, but I just want to thank everyone for coming so much. Thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoy the rest of the alumni reunion weekend, whatever that looks like for you. I look forward to seeing you at a future U of T event. And there will be some further information to come about free books. So don't miss that either.
And big thank you to Judith Rae, the Great. Yay.
Anytime, guys. And thanks U of T for organizing, of course.